The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin. Outside, the lake shimmered under the late afternoon sun, but inside, something felt off. Barbara could sense it, like a low hum in her chest that never quite settled. She stood in the kitchen, wiping down the already clean counter for the third time that hour. 65 years old, retired from nursing, and still unable to sit still when something gnawed at her gut. She glanced at the clock. 4:42 p.m. Thomas usually returned from his walk by now, and yet, silence. When the front door finally creaked open, Barbara turned quickly. Her husband stepped in, cheeks flushed from the cold, scarf tucked tight around his neck. He looked tired. Not just the kind of tired that came from a long walk, but the heavy, worn kind that clung to his shoulders. "You're late," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. "Stop by the bookstore," Thomas replied, shaking off his coat. They had that new collection of Frost's letters. Barbara nodded, eyes following his every move. He walked to his study, clutching a brown paper bag, like it held something more than just poetry. Something private. Later that evening, while Thomas showered, Barbara tidied up the living room. That's when she noticed the prescription bottle peeking from the edge of his satchel, just barely unzipped. Her hand moved without thinking, fingers curling around the white plastic. The name on the label stopped her cold. Dr. Patel, Oncology. Her chest tightened. A cold rush bloomed down her arms. She flipped the bottle over. The medication wasn't familiar, not one she remembered from her years in the ICU. But she didn't need the internet to tell her what it meant. Cancer. When Thomas emerged from the bathroom, hair damp and robe tied loosely, Barbara was already in the kitchen again, back to wiping the counter like a woman trying to erase a truth she wasn't ready to accept. "You didn't mention seeing a doctor lately," she said without turning around. Thomas paused. "No, nothing serious." "You sure? You're carrying medication from an oncologist." Silence. Barbara turned. He was frozen in place, jaw tight, eyes avoiding hers. And in that instant she knew he had been lying. Not just about the walk, not just about the bookstore, about everything. "I found the bottle, Thomas." He looked down. "It's nothing. A friend asked me to pick it up for him." Her breath caught. A friend. After 40 years of marriage, that's the best he could do? "Don't insult me," she said quietly. "You don't lie well." Thomas sighed and lowered himself into the armchair, rubbing his temples. "Barbara, I didn't want this. I didn't want to worry you. You're sick. I didn't want you to turn into a nurse again. I wanted you to stay my wife." She stared at him, fury and fear clawing at her ribs. "So instead you chose to lie? Let me wake up one morning to find you gone with no explanation?" "I'm not dying tomorrow." "But you are dying." He didn't answer. Barbara walked out onto the porch, slamming the screen door behind her. The cold slapped her skin, but she didn't flinch. She stood there, hands gripping the wooden rail, breath fogging in the air. The lake rippled gently, oblivious. It had been their home for 20 years, a place of peace and shared dreams. But now it felt like a stranger. Somewhere behind her, the man she loved was hiding pieces of himself, pieces she might never get back. And suddenly, Barbara felt very alone. If you were watching from afar, you'd see a woman standing strong in the cold, chin high, shoulders squared. But inside her, something was cracking. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to make her question what else she didn't know. That night, Barbara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed beside Thomas, the space between them colder than the wind outside. His back was to her, rising and falling with each breath. She wondered if he was pretending to sleep, or if he truly could, while she was unraveling beside him. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts moving too fast to catch. 42 years. Birthdays, broken bones, late-night arguments over nothing and everything. He had always been steady, quiet, reliable. But now, she realized that maybe Thomas had always held part of himself just out of reach. And she, perhaps too trusting, or too tired, never asked to see more. She rose from bed just before dawn, her feet instinctively padding toward the study. She didn't flip on the light. She didn't need to. The soft morning glow from the window was enough to see the desk, the brown bag, the stack of medical pamphlets peeking from beneath a folder. She sank into the leather chair. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. Blood work. Scans. The words glared back at her, harsh and clinical. Pancreatic carcinoma. Advanced. Non-operable. Her throat burned, but she made no sound. Years of nursing had taught her what came next. The weight loss, the pain, the way it slowly stole a person piece by piece. She reached for the notepad on the desk, needing something familiar to ground herself. But this wasn't an ordinary pad. It was a leather-bound journal, worn around the edges, pages thick and stained with ink. Thomas's handwriting, tight, elegant, deliberate. She hesitated. Then she opened to the first page. April 4th, confirmed what I feared. Stage 4, I should tell her. But I watched her today, humming as she gardened, so alive I couldn't do it. Not yet. Barbara's hand went to her mouth. April 12th. She noticed I've been tired. I said I was just getting old. She rolled her eyes and laughed. God, I'll miss that laugh. Each entry was short, but each one cracked something in her. Softly, gently, like ice breaking underfoot. May 3rd. I drove to the lake alone today. Thought about what it means to leave. Not just the world, but her. How do I go without tearing her apart? She turned page after page, tears falling freely now. There was no malice in his hiding. Only fear. A deep, aching fear that she now understood too well. Back in the bedroom, Thomas stirred when she returned. He blinked at her from the pillow, eyes swollen from sleep. You read it, he said softly. Barbara sat at the edge of the bed. You should have told me. I wanted to. I kept trying, but every time I looked at you, I just couldn't do it. I'm your wife, Thomas. I stood beside you through your father's death, through your surgery in '03, through your mother forgetting your name, and you thought I couldn't handle this? His voice cracked. It wasn't about handling it. It was about protecting you, letting you live without death in the room. Barbara shook her head. That's not how this works. You don't get to decide what I can bear. He sat up slowly, wincing. I know now, but I thought I was giving us peace. You were giving me a lie. There was a long silence. I'm scared, he whispered, and that's when the fury in her melted. Because beneath the betrayal, beneath the silence and the secrets, was the man she loved. Just a man. And he was scared. She reached for his hand. It felt thinner than she remembered. Me too. That morning they didn't speak much, but something shifted. A shared truth now sat between them, raw and painful, but real. Barbara spent the afternoon researching, not as a nurse, as a wife, a woman reclaiming control. She ordered meal plans, contacted a palliative care nurse she trusted, and dug out the soft fleece blanket Thomas loved in winter. She found the old photo album from their trip to Nova Scotia and left it on the coffee table. That evening, Thomas watched her from the recliner as she brewed herbal tea. You're turning the house into a hospice, he said with a crooked smile. No, Barbara replied. I'm turning it into a place where you can live well, for as long as you have. He looked at her, really looked at her. You're not going to let me die quietly, are you? No, she said, pouring the tea. But I'll let you die with dignity. There's a difference. He nodded, eyes wet. I knew you'd find out eventually. I just didn't know it would hurt this much. She sat beside him, pressing the warm mug into his hands. It hurts because we love each other. That's the price. Outside, the lake reflected the golden hues of sunset. And for the first time in weeks, Barbara didn't feel like something was lurking in the silence. The silence was simply peace. Hard-earned, fragile, and deeply, deeply real. The days that followed moved with a different kind of rhythm, slower, heavier, but also more intentional. Thomas no longer tried to hide his fatigue. Barbara no longer tried to pretend she wasn't watching him closely. The veil between them had lifted, and while that had brought pain, it had also made space for something deeper. One rainy morning, Barbara noticed Thomas sitting longer than usual by the window. He wasn't reading, he wasn't writing. He was just staring at the trees swaying in the mist, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of the leather-bound journal on his lap. You okay? She asked softly, bringing him a bowl of oatmeal sprinkled with brown sugar. He smiled without looking at her. I've been thinking about unfinished things. Barbara sat down across from him, stirring her own spoon through the steam. Like what? He paused. Like apologies I never made, people I hurt, regrets that never went anywhere except inside me. Barbara set her spoon down. You want to talk to someone? Thomas shook his head. It's not about fixing everything. It's just, I don't want to carry it all into the ground with me. She studied him. He wasn't asking for permission. He was preparing. Later that afternoon, while organizing a drawer of old paperwork in the study, Barbara came across a sealed envelope. It was addressed in Thomas's handwriting, but not to her. Liam Marshall. She froze. That name meant nothing to her. With trembling fingers, she opened a lower drawer and began digging through old letters, receipts, notebooks, anything that might connect the dots. At the back of the drawer, tucked beneath an envelope of faded photographs, she found a folded document, a birth certificate. Father, Thomas Jonathan Marshall. Mother, Evelyn Ray Carter. Child, Liam Daniel Carter. Born, 1976. Barbara's breath caught. The math worked out. Just before she and Thomas met, she stood in the middle of the room, clutching the paper, the ceiling tilting slightly as the weight of it all settled in. He had a son she never knew about, a son he had never mentioned in over 4 decades of marriage. And now he wanted to make peace. She didn't confront him right away. That night, she went through the motions: dinner, a movie rerun, a quiet conversation about the changing weather. But her mind was buzzing. When he fell asleep in his chair, a book on his chest and his glasses still perched on his nose, Barbara walked quietly to the kitchen and sat with the envelope again. She debated whether to open it. In the end, she didn't. She wanted to hear it from him. The next morning, Barbara waited until Thomas had finished his coffee before setting the birth certificate on the table. He stared at it for a long time, saying nothing. "I found it in your drawer," she said evenly. Still, no response. "Who is he, Thomas?" He exhaled, a long, defeated sound. "My son. Your son," she repeated like the word tasted unfamiliar. "He was born before I met you. Evelyn and I weren't serious. We were young. She moved away and didn't tell me until he was 5. By then, she didn't want anything from me, just for me to know. And you never thought I should know? I wanted to tell you, so many times, but then the years passed and I convinced myself it didn't matter anymore." Barbara was silent. "I wasn't hiding him out of shame," Thomas added quickly. "I was afraid of what it would do to us." She folded her arms. "What it did is make me wonder who else you've been." "I wrote to him last month," Thomas said, voice cracking. "Told him I was sick, that I was sorry." Barbara blinked. "Did he respond?" Thomas nodded slowly. "He's coming next week." The room felt small suddenly, too full of ghosts and truths that had taken too long to surface. Barbara stood. "I need air." Outside, the sky was pale and streaked with clouds, the lake quiet under the weight of autumn. Barbara walked down to the dock, arms wrapped tightly around herself. She didn't know how to feel. Betrayed, yes, but also sad. For the years lost. For the young man who never knew his father. For Thomas, who clearly carried the guilt in every line on his face. When she came back inside, Thomas was still at the table, the letter now open in front of him. He looked up. "You hate me." "I don't," she said softly. "But I need time to understand what this means." Thomas's eyes brimmed with tears. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to leave this world with a little less weight on my chest." Barbara pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. "Then let's start lifting it. Together." That night, she lay awake again. But this time, not from anger. She was thinking of Liam. Of what it would mean to meet the flesh and blood of the man she loved. Of whether she could extend grace not just to Thomas, but to herself for not seeing the hidden parts of him sooner. She had been a nurse for decades. She knew how wounds worked. Some stayed open longer than others. But with care, even the deepest ones had a chance to heal. She wasn't ready yet. But she was willing. And sometimes that was enough. Liam arrived on a Thursday. Barbara had spent the entire morning preparing, though she wouldn't admit it was for him. She dusted the picture frames in the living room, made sure the house smelled of cinnamon and baked apples, and even set out the good china. Something she hadn't used in years. Thomas sat quietly on the porch, too tired now to do much more than sip his tea and watch the trees sway. When the black sedan pulled into the gravel driveway, Barbara's hands stilled on the tray she was carrying. She watched through the window as a tall man stepped out, late 30s or early 40s, slim, dark-haired like Thomas had been in his youth. He wore jeans and a brown leather jacket, and he stood for a moment, unsure of what to do next, his hand resting awkwardly on the car door. Barbara opened the front door before he could knock. "You must be Liam," she said, voice steady. "Yes," he replied, offering a tentative smile. "Hi, I know who you are," she said gently. "Come in." Thomas's face lit up when Liam stepped inside. Not with joy exactly, more like relief, like something long buried had finally reached the surface and could be breathed in. Hey, Thomas said softly. Hi, Dad, Liam replied, his voice trembling slightly on the word. Barbara stepped back, giving them space. The two men embraced, awkward, brief, but real. Barbara watched, her heart both aching and opening. This was not how she imagined her golden years, meeting a stranger with her husband's eyes and calling him family. But here it was, life, unfolding the way it always did, messily, unexpectedly, and without apology. They spent the afternoon talking. Liam asked about Thomas's work, his health, about memories he'd tried to piece together from letters and stories his mother had shared. Thomas answered everything honestly, even when it hurt. Barbara mostly listened, making sure the tea stayed warm and the silence never grew too long. Later, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, Liam turned to her. I want to thank you, he said quietly, for letting me be here. Barbara smiled faintly. He wanted peace. I figured the least I could do was help him find it. I know this can't be easy. No, she admitted. But sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel easy. It just feels necessary. Liam nodded. That evening, the three of them sat by the fire. Thomas had grown weaker in recent days, his energy fleeting, his appetite almost gone. But that night, he asked for a sip of wine and a piece of Barbara's apple tart. She served it without a word, but her hands lingered just a little longer when she handed him the plate. You remember our trip to Nova Scotia? He asked suddenly, his voice raspy. Of course, Barbara replied. The cliffs, the way the wind nearly knocked us off our feet, you wore that ridiculous yellow scarf. She chuckled. You said I looked like a lemon, and you said you married me for my sense of humor. I lied, it was the beard. Liam laughed, and Thomas smiled, really smiled for the first time in days. Barbara excused herself to the kitchen, but once there, she leaned against the counter, gripping its edge as tears threatened to spill. This was what mattered. Not the betrayal, not the years lost, but this gathering, this mending of threads. She had a choice, to hold on to bitterness or to hold the space for healing. She chose the latter. That night, after Liam went to bed in the guest room, Barbara helped Thomas settle into their bed. She tucked the blanket around him and sat beside him, brushing back the wisps of gray from his forehead. You did good today, she whispered. He looked up at her, eyes tired but soft. Thank you. For everything. She didn't say, you're welcome. Instead, she pressed a kiss to his cheek and whispered, sleep. As the house grew quiet, Barbara stepped out onto the porch. The stars blinked down, cool and distant. She wrapped the yellow scarf around her neck, the one from Nova Scotia, and looked out over the lake. The water shimmered under the moonlight. Behind her, Thomas was sleeping, and in another room, a man with his father's eyes was beginning to understand what it meant to belong. Barbara closed her eyes. She was still hurting, still unsure. But tonight she felt something else, too. Something like peace beginning to form, soft and slow, like the morning mist curling over the water. It wasn't a finish, but it was a beginning. And that was enough. The decline came faster than Barbara had prepared for. One morning, Thomas couldn't get out of bed. His voice was little more than a whisper, his breath shallow. The tea she brought him sat untouched on the nightstand. He was slipping. Barbara knew the signs. She had seen this arc before in hospital beds and hospice rooms, but never like this. Never with the man whose toothbrush had sat next to hers for 42 years. She called the palliative nurse, who came and adjusted his medications, murmuring softly about comfort measures and the next few days. Barbara nodded, her face calm, her posture straight. She knew how to wear the mask. But behind it, her heart was fracturing in quiet, relentless pieces. Liam extended his stay without question. He became Barbara's silent partner in these final days, running errands, helping with medication, sitting beside his father for hours just to hold his hand. Sometimes they spoke. Other times they didn't. Sometimes that silence was its own language. On the third night, Thomas stirred around midnight. Barbara was dozing in the chair beside him, the leather journal clutched in her lap. When she looked up, he was gazing at her, eyes glassy but focused. You remember the music box? He rasped. Barbara nodded. The one we found in Quebec? He smiled faintly. Still makes the same song. You keep everything. You taught me that, she said softly, to hold on. He reached for her hand, his grip weak but warm. Don't hold on too tight. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I don't want you to be afraid, she whispered. I'm not, he said. Not with you here. She bent over and pressed her forehead to his. "I'm here. I'll be right here." And she was, through the long night as his breaths grew slower, then shallower, until they faded into silence just before dawn. There was no struggle, no fear, just a soft sigh, like a door quietly closing. Barbara didn't move for a long time. The room was still, the lake outside just beginning to catch the light. She sat beside him, one hand on his chest, now still, the other on her lap, gripping the yellow scarf she hadn't taken off for days. Liam came in a little while later. He didn't say a word, just knelt beside his father's bed, head bowed. Barbara finally stood. She pulled the blanket up to Thomas's shoulders, brushing her fingers across his hair one last time. "He waited," she murmured. "He waited until it felt safe." They made the calls together, arranged everything the way Thomas had written it in his journal. No church service, no suits, just a quiet gathering by the lake, where his ashes would be scattered on the water he had loved for so many years. Friends came, said kind things. Liam spoke briefly. Barbara didn't speak at all. She just stood on the dock, watching the ash drift and dissolve into the ripples, her hand wrapped around the edge of her coat, clutching it close to her chest. That night, the house felt impossibly empty. Barbara sat in the living room, staring at the space where his chair had always been. It was funny, the absence of sound, of breathing, of shuffling footsteps was louder than anything else. Liam sat beside her. He didn't try to fill the silence. Finally, Barbara said, "He told me once he didn't want to leave me with memories of hospitals and medicine. He wanted me to remember the poems, the sunsets, the music box." Liam nodded. "I think he got his wish." She looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "You gave him peace, just by coming." He looked down. "I thought I'd feel angry, for all the time we didn't have, but now I just feel lucky I had any at all." Barbara reached for his hand. They sat like that until the fire burned low. In the days that followed, the house began to shift. Slowly, gently. Barbara moved Thomas's books to make room for the plants he always said took up too much space. She kept his flannel shirt on the hook by the door. She wrote in his journal, not as a diary, but as letters to him. Some were short, others went on for pages, but they all ended the same way, with love, always with love. Spring arrived quietly, the lake thawed, the wind softened, and birds returned to the trees outside the window where Thomas once sat, his cup of tea always within reach. Barbara found herself watching the seasons now with a different kind of attention, almost reverence, as if noticing the changing light was her way of staying in conversation with him. A year had passed. The grief was no longer sharp like broken glass. It had dulled into something gentler, something that lived in the background of her days. She didn't cry as often. But when she did, it was not from pain alone. It was from memory, from gratitude, from love that had nowhere left to go but inward. Barbara had started writing, not just letters in Thomas's journal, but full reflections, essays, short stories, fragments of the life they'd built. With encouragement from a local writing group, she began submitting pieces to small publications. One of them, titled The Yellow Scarf, was picked up by a regional magazine. It was a story not just about loss, but about forgiveness, about finding peace in the aftermath of secrets, and about loving someone fully, even when you don't know everything. She received dozens of letters after it was published, from widows, from adult children, from people whose loved ones had died with unfinished business. Some shared their own stories. Others simply wrote, "Thank you. I didn't know I needed to read this." One envelope stood out. No return address. Inside was a simple card. It read, "He loved you until his last breath. Thank you for letting me say goodbye, L." Barbara held the card to her chest. The next morning, she brewed a pot of tea and walked down to the dock, wrapped in the same yellow scarf she'd worn during that final winter. The sun had just risen, casting gold across the water. She sat for a while in silence. Then, as if speaking to the wind, she whispered, "I kept my promise, Thomas. I didn't run from the pain. I faced it, and I lived." She looked out at the lake, so calm, so endless, and allowed herself to smile, not because it didn't hurt anymore, but because she had loved deeply, survived wholly, and found her way to peace. And somewhere, she believed, he was still listening, still with her, in the wind, in the trees, in the echo of her own heartbeat, always. This story reminds us that love doesn't end when life does. It explores the power of forgiveness, the quiet strength of truth, and how even in the face of death, connection can be found and healing can begin. What did this story make you feel? Share your thoughts in the comments. Type 2 if you liked it, or 7 if it didn't speak to you. And if you want more heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world and helps us keep telling stories that matter.